There's a moment every motocross rider remembers. You pull into the staging area, your boots are still caked from the last moto, and somebody fires up a two-stroke 20 feet away. The sound hits you before anything else. Sharp, violent, cracking through the air like a whip. Then the smell follows, that sweet, almost intoxicating burn of castor oil mixing with exhaust. And without even looking up, you already know two things: what brand of pipe is on that bike, and exactly what kind of rider is sitting behind the bars. It was the era when the pipe on your dirt bike told everybody in the pits exactly who you were. Not just what bike you rode, but what kind of rider you were. This is the Pipe Wars. The pipe only meant that much because two-strokes made it matter. In the 1970s and 80s, America was flooded with Japanese dirt bikes, and riders fell in love with how light and explosive they were.
Anna in the whole shot, O'Mara next to him. And Jeff Ward now moving into second. In front of Anna, Ward goes down!
Two-stroke engines were basically controlled explosions happening hundreds of times a minute. And the exhaust pipe wasn't just there to route gases away from the engine. It was a critical, active part of how the motor made power. The concept goes back even further than American motocross. A German engineer named Walter Kaaden, who'd worked on rocket-propelled weapons during the Second World War, figured out in the 1950s that you could use acoustic waves inside an exhaust pipe to push unburnt fuel back into the combustion chamber before the piston sealed it. The pipe could actually increase power by 20% or more if the geometry was right. That's not a small number. That's the difference between winning and watching. When the Japanese factories started mass-producing bikes for the American market, their stock exhaust systems were built for cost and consistency. Thick stamped steel, conservative designs, and power outputs tuned for the middle of the road. They worked, but they left a very obvious door open. A door that a few guys in Southern California decided to walk straight through. What grew out of that was something genuinely American. Independent pipe builders started hand-rolling cones of thin sheet metal, welding them together into wild, bulbous shapes that unlocked the acoustic potential Kaaden had described. They were messy, they were loud, they were sometimes brilliant, and they changed everything. The aftermarket exhaust became the first and most important modification any serious rider made. You bought the bike, and within weeks, sometimes days, that stock pipe was on a shelf collecting dust. The reason the pipe mattered so much culturally, beyond what it did for performance, was simple visibility. Engine porting happened inside a sealed cylinder nobody could see. Suspension work was buried inside fork tubes. But the exhaust pipe wrapped around the front of the engine in plain sight. It was the first thing anyone noticed when they looked at your bike. It announced your intentions before you ever turned a lap. Don Emler didn't start a company, he started an obsession. In 1973, in a garage in Hawthorne, California, Emler was hand-welding pipes for his own race bikes because he wanted to go faster and couldn't afford to pay someone else to do it. He called it Flying Machine Factory. The name alone tells you something about the man. The bikes he built were running so well at local tracks that riders started showing up and asking him to build pipes for their machines too. Business wasn't the goal, speed was. Business just followed. FMF grew into something different from anything else in the aftermarket, not because they were the cheapest option, but because Emler himself was the living embodiment of the rider who loved the sport for its own sake. He was chasing desert races, trail rides, and the free ride side of the sport. The guy who had a beat-up truck, a tent, and a cooler full of drinks at the local track. The rider who was out there on a Tuesday afternoon when most people were at work.
Besides performance would be sound, the tone that you hear when it comes out of the machine. Not making something.
The Fatty Gold Series pipe became the most important product in the FMF catalog and probably the most culturally significant two-stroke pipe in American motocross history. It was nickel-plated, which meant it resisted rust and cleaned up with a rag, and it broadened the power band in a way that made bikes more fun to ride across all skill levels. You could ride the bike a gear high and the FMF would still pull. It rewarded you for riding naturally rather than demanding you stay pinned in a narrow, aggressive power window. That accessibility was the whole point. FMF wasn't asking you to be a factory rider, it was inviting you to have the time of your life on a dirt bike. And the sound. If you've ever been in a staging area when someone fired up a YZ or a CR with an FMF Fatty and a Shorty silencer, you never forgot it. The Shorty produced a sharp, almost violent bark that cut right through background noise. Riders used to blip the throttle aggressively before a moto gate drop just to put that sound in everyone else's head. Off the bike, FMF's aesthetic was just as loud. The red and yellow oval logo was everywhere in the 1990s. You saw it on truck windows, toolboxes, garage walls, and just about anywhere riders wanted to mark their world. It was a badge that said something specific about you. FMF ran alongside No Fear apparel in the entire action sports culture that was exploding through that decade, and it all blended into one coherent identity: rebellion, freedom, dirt. Mitch Payton's story shouldn't exist. At 17 years old, he was a rising desert racing champion in AMA District 37. Then in 1978, a crash left him paralyzed. Most people would have walked away from motorsport completely. Payton bought a struggling Husqvarna dealership at 18 years old and started over from the inside. Learning to port cylinders by hand came first, then rolling pipes. The work became obsessive, the way people do things when they're trying to prove something to themselves and everyone around them. WWII, the editor of Motocross Action magazine, eventually pushed Payton toward building pipes for Japanese bikes rather than just Husqvarnas. Payton designed a pipe for the Honda CR125, and because every third bike at every track in America was a CR125, it sold immediately and in volume.
And then he says, why don't you do a Japanese bike? If you think those are great, you should do something else. And I think we finally did a 125 Honda pipe, and then that outsold everything.
Pro Circuit almost had a very different name. Payton originally printed shirts with PCP, short for Pro Circuit Products, until Weisel pointed out that PCP was also the street name for angel dust. Pro Circuit was born, and the rest is a matter of record. Where FMF built its identity around inclusion and freedom, Pro Circuit built one around an almost brutal standard of excellence. The Works pipe was the product that defined them: raw, unplated carbon steel, hand-welded with seams pounded by hand to mirror the exhaust systems built by factory race teams spending millions of dollars a year. No protective coating, no rust resistance, just bare metal that oxidized the moment moisture touched it. That detail is everything you need to understand about Pro Circuit's culture. Running a raw Works pipe meant accepting a maintenance ritual that most riders would walk away from. Every single ride, every single wash, you dried the pipe, scrubbed it with a Scotch-Brite pad to knock back the surface rust, and coated it in WD-40. Then you did it again after the next ride. To anyone outside motocross, paying a premium for a product that required that much upkeep seemed like a bad deal. To the riders who ran it, the maintenance was the whole point. It was proof. Proof that you were serious. Proof that you put in hours in the garage that your competition didn't. The Works pipe also delivered power in a way that punished you if you didn't deserve it. It was what riders called pipey, meaning the power was concentrated in a high RPM band at the top of the rev range. You let the engine drop below that zone, the bike bogged. If you kept it screaming, it was faster than almost anything else on the track. Riding a Pro Circuit equipped 125 demanded commitment. You couldn't coast on it. You had to be on it constantly, every corner exit, every straight. That dynamic created a self-selecting group of riders who ran Pro Circuit pipes. They were the ones chasing championships, the ones doing gate practice at 7 a.m., the ones at Loretta Lynn's Amateur National with their parents running pit boards and their bikes wrapped in factory-matching graphics. Pro Circuit was the exhaust of serious ambition, and Mitch Payton had built an entire factory race team culture around exactly that identity. In 1991, Pro Circuit launched Team Peak Honda with riders including Jeremy McGrath and Steve Lamson on CR125s. They dominated both coasts of the 125 Supercross series. The message was impossible to miss. Pro Circuit didn't just make fast pipes, they made champions. The 1993 season, though, almost ended all of it. Honda pulled their 125 support back in-house after the 1992 season, leaving Payton facing financial ruin. In a move that bordered on desperate, Payton secured backing from Kawasaki's Team Green program and, in one of the stranger sponsorship deals in motorsport history, received title sponsorship from Mattel's Hot Wheels after a trademark dispute over a video game named Pro Circuit. Payton and his crew, including suspension specialist Jim Bacon, stayed up through the night grinding cylinders and engineering production Kawasaki's into race-winning machines. Jimmy Gaddis won the 125 West Region Supercross title that year. That story became part of Pro Circuit's DNA. They'd survived a collapse through sheer refusal to quit, and every pipe they built afterward carried some weight of that. The rivalry between FMF and Pro Circuit wasn't just being played out on a dyno or on a track. It was being played out in the staging areas of amateur nationals, in parking lots at local tracks, and in the garages of teenagers across the country who were making their first purchasing decision as motocross riders. You could look across a row of bikes and tell an enormous amount about who each rider thought they were, just from the pipe hanging off the frame. The FMF kid probably had stickers on his truck and gear from companies that screamed action sports culture. He might not have been on a factory program, but he had more fun on a dirt bike than most people have doing anything. The Pro Circuit kid had his graphics matched to whatever factory Kawasaki or Honda team he idolized. His bike was immaculate, and he probably had a notebook with his lap times in it. Neither identity was wrong. That was the whole thing. The sport was big enough to hold both of them. But the pipe on your bike was the first signal you sent before you ever threw a leg over, and riders understood the signal very clearly. The tribalism spilled into everything. You saw it in pit setups, truck windows, even the kinds of races riders cared most about. FMF lived in the desert race and freeride world as much as stadium racing. Pro Circuit's heart was always on the starting gate of a supercross or a national, with its eyes on the professional ranks. What made it fascinating from the outside was watching how these two companies occasionally crossed paths in uncomfortable ways. At the factory level, loyalty shifted with sponsorship dollars. FMF became the exhaust supplier for the factory Kawasaki 450 program, a team that Pro Circuit had been supplying with for years. Even if the arrangement didn't last long, it was enough to get people talking. For riders who had spent decades seeing Kawasaki and Pro Circuit linked together, it felt strange seeing another logo in that spot. At the amateur and everyday rider level, those shifts barely registered. People had already picked their identity, and a manufacturer contract wasn't going to change how they felt about the pipe on their own bike. While FMF and Pro Circuit were fighting their war over two-stroke riders, a company in Southern California was doing something that almost nobody else in motocross believed in. White Brothers Cycle Specialties, founded in 1975 by twin brothers Tom and Dan White, had been selling aftermarket parts for years. Tom White was a former AMA national dirt tracker, and he had a stubborn, almost irrational belief in the potential of four-stroke motorcycles for motocross racing. Through the 1980s and early 1990s, that belief required a kind of patience that most people in the industry didn't have. Four-strokes were seen as trail bikes, heavier, more complicated, and still unable to match the explosive power-to-weight ratio of a tuned two-stroke expansion chamber. The AMA Professional Motocross Series was completely two-stroke country. Nobody with serious money was betting on thumpers. Tom White bet everything on them anyway. Just 1 year after starting White Brothers in 1975, Tom helped launch the World Four-Stroke Championship in California. He put up prize money, secured sponsors, prompted the races, and stood at the microphone as announcer, because almost nobody else in American motocross was willing to take four-stroke seriously. At a time when the mainstream AMA calendar treated thumpers like an afterthought, White gave them their own stage. That commitment eventually turned White Brothers into one of the largest aftermarket companies in motocross. Their catalog stretched past 1,300 pages. They employed close to 200 people, annual revenue crossed $40 million, and by the late 1990s, the company was positioned perfectly for the four-stroke future Tom White had spent decades trying to convince the industry was coming. Their technical contribution to the four-stroke movement came through the E-Series exhaust. A four-stroke engine works completely differently from a two-stroke, and the exhaust dynamics are nothing like an expansion chamber. White Brothers developed a system with a patented tunable disc mechanism at the end of the silencer. Riders could physically add or remove elliptical discs to adjust how the exhaust flowed. More discs opened up top-end power and raised the volume. Fewer discs built back pressure for more low-end torque and quieter operation. It was interactive tuning, the kind that made riders think about their exhaust system as a variable rather than a fixed quantity. The E-Series became the defining exhaust of the late 1990s off-road scene, and when four-strokes finally started moving into the center of professional motocross, White Brothers was already there waiting. In 1997, KTM built a 538cc four-stroke race bike for rider Lance Smale under an AMA exemption rule. At the Daytona Supercross that year, Smale did something that had never happened before. His 4-stroke KTM qualified for a Premier Class AMA Supercross main event. The deep, ground-shaking rumble of that bike rolling around the Daytona infield was a sound nobody had heard at that level of racing before. It was a signal that the era everyone thought would last forever was already ending. A year later, Yamaha released the YZ400F, the first modern lightweight production 4-stroke motocross bike. White Brothers moved on it immediately, and Doug Dubeck, Yamaha's primary test and development writer for the 400F project, worked closely with White Brothers throughout that period as 4-stroke racing started moving into the mainstream. By 2004 and 2005, the transition was complete, and White Brothers was at the absolute top of the factory paddock. Kevin Wyndham, Tim Ferry, David Villeman, Keith Voss, and Chad Reed were all running White Brothers Carbon Pro exhaust systems at the AMA national level. The Carbon Pro was an exotic, ultra-lightweight carbon fiber system, and White Brothers was customizing header specifications for each individual factory rider. Reed's setup was tuned more for over-rev, Wyndham's was dialed for more bottom-end. This was bespoke engineering at the highest level. But underneath that success, the foundation had already started to shift. Tom White sold the company in 2000 to the MAG Group, and what followed was a quiet unraveling that took years to fully play out. Stripped of its founder's racing instincts and a relentless product development pace, White Brothers lost factory contracts one by one as FMF and Pro Circuit aggressively moved into 4-stroke development and brought their established prestige with them. The company that had built the 4-stroke revolution from nothing eventually closed its doors. Tom White moved on to become a philanthropist and historian of the sport he loved. After a serious accident left his son Brad severely brain injured, White donated millions to brain injury research and opened the Early Years of Motocross Museum, housing 170 bikes and running fundraising events for charity. He passed away in 2017. The 4-stroke future he'd insisted on for 30 years had already reshaped the entire sport before he was gone. The 4-stroke era brought something nobody in the exhaust industry had fully anticipated, a problem that threatened not just sales, but the physical survival of the places where motocross happened. 2-stroke expansion chambers were loud, but their acoustic signature was high-pitched and relatively localized. Sound waves dissipated quickly over distance. 4-stroke racing exhausts operated differently. The low-frequency sound they produced traveled for miles, penetrating walls and windows across neighborhoods that had been built in the expanding suburbs around California's historic riding areas. As amateur riders bolted open-core aftermarket exhausts onto their new 454 strokes to match the factory setups they saw on television, the collective volume of the sport became a political issue. Sound complaints gave local municipalities and homeowners associations the legal mechanism they needed to challenge track operations. Carlsbad Raceway, Saddleback Park, Corona, iconic venues that had been part of Southern California motocross for decades closed one by one, their demise accelerated by the cumulative noise of the very machines the industry had championed. The AMA and local racing districts pushed back with strict sound limits, enforcing 96 decibel caps at staging areas under a campaign called Less Sound Equals More Ground. For an industry that had spent 30 years competing to build the loudest, most aggressive exhaust notes, this was a complete inversion of the mission. FMF responded with one of their most genuinely clever engineering achievements. FMF's team developed the Power Bomb and then the Mega Bomb header, which built a patented expansion chamber directly into the 4-stroke titanium head pipe. The technology functioned as a pre-muffler, using acoustic physics to reduce sound output by as much as 1.5 decibels while simultaneously improving exhaust flow and adding horsepower. Pro Circuit followed with their own resonance chamber designs. The pipe wars had started as a competition to be the loudest thing in the staging area. They ended as a competition to save the staging areas entirely by engineering silence without giving up performance. By the end of the 2-stroke era, exhaust pipes had become part of the motocross identity. It was the voice of dirt bikes and, by extension, the voice of whoever was riding it. FMF survived and grew because Don Emler never stopped being the guy in the garage who just wanted to go faster and bring everyone along with him. Pro Circuit became an institution because Mitch Payton treated every championship as a debt that needed to be paid, and that mentality ran through everything his shop produced. White Brothers built a future that the entire sport eventually moved into, and then learned the hard lesson that a company without its founder's soul can't hold on to what that founder built. Every rider who pulled into a staging area and fired up their machine in that era was participating in something bigger than a race. They were announcing themselves. The pipe they ran and the sound that came out of that silencer told people something before the rider ever said a word. That kind of cultural weight is rare, and the motocross community still carries it. What pipe defined your era of riding, and did it actually say something about the kind of rider you were? Thanks for watching, and stay wicked.